Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Arie. I'm a member of the Board of Coordinators of the European Platform Against Religious Intolerance and Discrimination, also called EPRID in short, together with Alessandro Pecorari of Christian Solidarity Worldwide and Elizabeta Kitanovic from the Conference of European Churches. I'm the Brussels representative of the European Evangelical Alliance, and I will co-host this webinar together with Dr. Elizabeta Kitanovic. She is the Executive Secretary for Human Rights of the Conference of European Churches. Welcome, Elizabeta. EPRID is an interfaith platform of non-governmental organizations. Together, we defend and promote freedom of religion or belief for all. In previous episodes, we discussed some national and international policies for promoting FoRB. In today's webinar, we will zoom in on violations of FoRB, and more in particular, on the way these violations impact women. It's my pleasure to welcome our guests for today, Ed Brown and Helene Fischer, in alphabetical order. Ed Brown is the Secretary General of the Stefanus Alliance, based in Norway. Ed has a long track record in investigating and in promoting FoRB, and he's one of the founding members of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief and of the FoRB Learning Platform. Welcome, Ed. Helene Fischer is the Global Gender Persecution Specialist of Open Doors International. She has tracked global behavioral patterns related to women and religious persecution since 2007. In 2018, she instigated and began co-authoring the annual gender-specific religious persecution report of Worldwatch Research. She has been an invited expert for the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, the US Ministerial on International Religious Freedom, and European government entities. Helene has been involved in developing trauma care training in Central African Republic and has co-developed the social biblical program Restorations, which was first piloted in the Middle East to address unwitting church complicity in religious persecution dynamics. Welcome, Helene. So we have two distinguished speakers. Great to have them with us. Both the Stefanus Alliance and Open Doors International issued reports on FoRB and gender earlier this year, and we will share the link to these reports in the chat. As member of EPRID, we are all too familiar with the various forms of violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief. Today, we'll focus on the particular vulnerability of women. Gender inequality belongs amongst the most prevalent forms of social inequality and exists all over the world, with different effects in different regions. These differences are primarily due to cultural legacies, historical development, geographic location, and last but not least, the religious norms which predominate in society. Religion plays a vital role in the cultural life of different spaces. It's deeply rooted in people's experiences and influences the socio-economic and political directions of societies. The status of women in society is an outcome of the interpretation of religious text and of the cultural and institutional setup of religious communities. So, how does that impact freedom of religion or belief for women? Over to our guests. Before we go to the questions, Helene, can I invite you to do a short summary of the report? In the chat, we will share the link to these reports from both Open Doors International and the Stefanus Alliance. But Helene, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Arie, and it's an honor to share with you very briefly today. Thank you so much for having us here on the panel. And here are a few highlights from the 2021 Gender-Specific Religious Persecution Report. Now that's quite a mouthful, so very often we just say GSRP. As you have seen, and if you're familiar with Open Doors, we do often work in Christian communities But the findings that we are sharing with you today, we feel are applicable to other minority religious populations. And of course, we have seen patterns of attack and persecution across all regions and religions, from the Yazidi in Iraq to the Christians like Leah Sharibu in Nigeria to the Rohingya Muslim women from Myanmar. And you may have your own group of faith or belief which you feel today actually experiences the same sorts of dynamics that we are going to discuss. In discussing this, of course, we are talking about a select number of countries, and this is the set of countries that our research is based upon. It's about 50 countries, although sometimes we expand it to 74 countries. GSRP focuses on the intersection between a person's vulnerabilities as a member of a religious minority and as a man or a woman. Or, as we would say it, either their vulnerabilities in terms of FoRB or their vulnerabilities in terms of gender equality or inequality. I get asked a lot of questions about how this works. So what we very often say is that it's like a crime. And of course, violations of human rights are crimes. And very often in crime dramas, and I confess I do like a good crime drama, we distinguish between motive, means, and opportunity. And what we see in our research and what we define is that the motive is very often relative to the religious characteristic of a population, but the means are very often related to gender inequality. It's like the difference between trying to kill somebody with a gun, which is really obvious, or poison, where you're not sure a crime has been committed. But the result is the same in both cases. The person is dead. It's just harder to identify. And which means is used very often depends on the particular situation where the perpetrator is seeking their opportunity. And in order to do this, we identify pressure points. Now, I don't do martial arts, but I have been told that on the body, there are pressure points. That is to say, sensitive nerve points on the body. And if you can manage to press that, you can incapacitate your otherwise very strong opponent. And what we have discovered is that the pressure points in a global pattern are very different for men and women when it comes to religious persecution. Now, this is not an analysis of intensity per country, but we're discovering patterns of how Christian men and women experience persecution and discrimination in places that are hostile to their faith. And if you can read the screen, you will see that men most commonly experience physical violence, harassment via work and imprisonment by government, and women are most commonly targeted utilizing forced marriage or sexual violence. And as we have studied this over the past 4 years, we have characterized all of the differences in 3 easy to remember sets of words for men and women. So for men, persecution tends to be focused, severe, and visible, whereas for women, it tends to be hidden, violent, and complex. That is to say, targeting women in a number of different ways. And one of the things that makes it work for both men and women is shame dynamics, and we can talk about that later. But overall, we find that GSRP attacks how society values men and women. So in many societies, men's value is in their role as provider, or in the Christian context, as a church leader. Whereas women in many societies, their value is around their perceived sexual purity and their family status. Now, we have a number of other findings this year related to the fact that the purpose of attacking men and women always has to do with community impact and how women's bodies are weaponized either through trafficking or other means. And you can read in the report about conflict zones and how COVID has impacted this. One of the resources I'd like to point out for you, which can go into the chat, is that we have an interactive map as a way of processing all the information. But the most important thing for us today really is what can we do about it? And so we'll be answering questions on how local faith actors can promote gender equality within their faith and why that's so important, and also what can be done for policymakers to address FoRB and gender equality from outside the faith community. So that's the quick introduction from my side.
Thank you, Helen, for this wonderful summary that you have made of a report, which is very important for our audience and also for the European institution, like to have this kind of overview and see what kind of recommendations are necessary for on the institutional level to be done in order to improve the situation concerning women who are prosecuted due to their freedom of religion or belief. And now we turn to Ed. Ed, the floor is yours.
Okay, fair enough. I don't think I was going to say as much as Helene had to say. Our report isn't really a report. It is an educational tool. So it sort of supplements what the Open Doors report does. That documents ways, means, places that the violations occur. And our booklet offers religious liberty or FoRB literacy in a gender-specific context. So we'll get back to it when we come to some of the specific questions that I'll get to later, but that's enough for now.
Okay, thank you, Ed. So we start with a series of questions that we have prepared. So Helen, what made you study the distinction between men and women in relation to the right to freedom of religion or belief?
Well, Elizabeta, as Arie was saying, I've been hearing these stories and having contact through Open Doors with people in these countries that we study since 2007. And as I traveled around, I and other people I worked with, we were hearing stories that sounded very similar from one region to the other. We would travel thousands of miles only to hear a very similar story and think, I just heard that, but it was a long ways away. So we asked ourselves, well, is this more than anecdotal? Is it just the people I happen to meet, but actually it's not something that we could statistically talk about as a pattern. And because Open Doors has a research unit, and because we were seeing great damage done by these stories we were hearing, we asked ourselves, can we turn the focus of that unit to answer this question? Are there global patterns? Is there a trackable, definable, quantifiable difference between the way that men and women are targeted?
Yeah, thank you. So how do you obtain, you told a little bit about stories, but also in your summary, you identified the persecution of women as often hidden. Mm. So how do you get these stories out more than just the one-on-one stories that you hear? How do you get the information you need for your report?
Well, that really is the question, isn't it, Arie? It's how do we get to that? And that really goes to the heart of why our research stays within the Christian community, because that is where we are trusted. We have trusted networks and contacts. and they will share with us this very, very sensitive information because they trust how we will process it. They trust the fact that we will keep anonymous and not endanger those that we're talking about as we produce these reports. So it really goes to talking with the people who are not always the first-hand survivors, but those who work with the first-hand survivors. So it's not just their story, but it's dozens and hundreds and sometimes thousands of stories that they hear, either because they themselves are part of that community, or they are trauma care workers, or they're other professionals within that community, and they have privileged access to it.
Is there a difference between forms of violations as faced by men or women? And what are the most obvious ones? So Ed, the report claims the following. Unfortunately, many people, both men and women, from different religious and belief communities around the world have defended practices that undermine gender equality by claiming them to be protected by freedom of religion or belief. So can you give us some examples of these practices which are described in your report?
Sure. So in the Open Doors report, they talk about hidden, violent, and complex. And the complexity we see in many different places here, where you might have a mixture of religious laws and secular laws, or you have a parallel system where you have a secular law system, and then the state allows for religious laws for the various religious communities, which then mean that women who, say, belong to a religious community, want to break out of a marriage, and here's a specific case, they would be governed by the religious laws of that community. But let's say they want to break out of that religious community, and they no longer want to be part of that community, and they want to be tried under secular laws. They're stuck, because then the adherents of the religious community claim, no, they're still part of our community, therefore they must abide by our rules. But she says, I no longer am part of that community, and the state, because it allows for the religious community to govern and doesn't trump it, causes a huge problem for this in inheritance laws, in custody, child custody laws, in the right to divorce, all sorts of problems. And here the challenge, of course, is the state doesn't meet its obligations. And we'll get back to this, I'll repeat it a few more times, that we really have to work with member states in protecting individuals who choose to break with the norms or break completely with their religious communities. And so for women, this is particular a vulnerability. But then you also have general access to sexual and reproductive health. If a woman wants to get contraceptives, for instance, and her religious community says no, but she wants to go against her religious community, again, the state should be providing the opportunity for her to get that without her having to necessarily break from her community if she doesn't want to. And so there's that parallel between the religious laws, which are then linked to the state, which then undermine the woman's right to actually not have 10 children if she doesn't want to have 10 children. And then, of course, you have the most egregious female genital mutilation, for instance. And I'll talk about that later when you ask me a question coming down about a friend of mine in Egypt who then how he did away with this particular practice. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. These are terrible stories about power and religion working together. Helen, you mentioned rape and abductions as frequent forms of gender-specific religious persecution, and these are horrible stories. Well, in your report, you also indicate that there's both a direct effect, which is obvious, but also an indirect effect on the whole community. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yes. So I think we're all quite familiar with the direct effects of these terrible physical assaults violating somebody. However, what we're less aware of sometimes are what result in what we would then call compound trauma for the individual. And this is illustrated by the work that I went to Central African Republic for, was that we were working in communities where large numbers of women and girls had experienced rape, gang rape, public gang rape. And not only were they left with terrible kind of emotional, psychological, physical damage, and very often ongoing health concerns that resulted from that, but also because of the stigma associated with this and the fact that their community now viewed them as impure, they were called and are called adulteresses. Then they were rejected from their homes, rejected from their communities, and literally found themselves on the streets. Now, sometimes when we talk about that, we are shocked, of course, that one day these women are very respectable church members, maybe a bit proud of that, and then literally the next day they find themselves a pariah on the street, no shelter. But then we also, if we're a little bit objective, we'll step back even further and say, well, not only did that woman lose her home, but her home lost a mother and a wife. So that family now splinters, and then her community now has a family that is broken and in mourning and losing its bearings within it. So there's this ripple effect of damage that's caused by an external event, but unfortunately, sometimes it is perpetuated within the very community that has been a victim of the initial event.
Thank you, Helen. Stefanus Alliance reports an impromptu ceremony to welcome women who were abducted and forcibly converted by Islamic State back into the community. Ed, can you tell us a bit more about that? And Helen, are you aware of similar rituals in the Christian community, for example, case of girls abducted by Boko Haram in Nigeria? Ed?
Thank you. So page 27 in our report, for any of you who have it or have clicked on the link, you'll see that little anecdote. So you will recall in Iraq, especially northern Iraq, the Yazidi community was extremely traumatized, and they were given no options whatsoever. The men were killed outright. Christians were often given the opportunity to convert before they were killed or forced to flee. Yazidi men killed, women sold into slavery. Horrible situation. Now, unfortunately, in Yazidi theology, this same sort of shame dynamics that Helene talked about, with the women bearing the purity of the community on their shoulders, or in their sexuality, more correctly, it comes out to play here. And so while through no fault of their own, these women have been raped multiple times by multiple men. Some of them have become impregnated and had children. And now once they're brought back to their homes or their home communities, the theology of the Yazidis that has this purity idea would not allow them to rejoin the community. And the community, of course, has their, all of their social capital lies within this community. And without that, they don't have anywhere to go. And so this was brought up amongst the leadership, and the Baba Sheikh, the leader of the Yazidi community, handed down a new interpretation of their laws, or an exemption to their theological laws, which allowed for a cleansing ritual to then allow these women to come back into their community, which we see then a very important feature here. Religions are not etched in stone. They're not reified. They can be changed, and they do change. And no religion that I know of that's existed more than one day is exactly the same as it was the day before, for not to speak of 10 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. So all religions can change. And this gives us hope, of course. And that change, as we'll talk about a little bit later, must come, or comes in a best, most sustainable way within the communities themselves. And here, the Yazidi community has found a solution to bring these women back. Now, just to add on the negative note, for the women who have had children, they haven't provided that. And so the children aren't allowed back in the community because they're looked at as Muslim children and they can't be provided. So I'm hoping and praying that the Yazidi community finds a theological solution that will allow for this to happen. So women don't have to choose between re-entering their own community or giving up their children. Anyway, thank you.
Helen?
Yes, Elizabeta, you asked about how is this working out? Have I seen it work out in the Christian community? I think one of the things that is remarkable about the Yazidi community is that because it's limited to a small area, they actually instituted a ceremony, a liturgy that they were able to say this will actually count as a purification, as a way of externalizing that. What we're seeing in our networks is different communities working through this in some ways on their own. So on the Boko Haram, in the Nigerian context, what we have seen is that as we come alongside and other organizations come alongside those girls who have returned, it's not just a question of coming alongside the girls, but more of going to their communities and going back to some of the very fundamental sacred texts that they all believe as part of their religion, but have never really thought about applying in that way. So there are many things in the Christian narrative about being cleansed in and having a purity before God, which very simply we have taken, and other organizations have taken and said, this actually means that your daughter, your wife, your sister is innocent of this thing that has happened to her. And one of the things that is, of course, incredibly important, as Ed has pointed out, is then the question of the next generation. And I just got an email today from one of our coworkers in Southeast Asia who has been working with a family. The young woman was kidnapped last year in 2020, and she was basically trafficked into a forced marriage. And it took an extremely long time to recover her from the situation. That was exacerbated by COVID and the inability to move around, the fact that police forces are occupied with other things. But when they eventually when actually restrictions were lifted there, the family who held her captive went out. They were so excited and that they could actually go out freely. And they were so excited they forgot to lock the door. And she was actually able to get out and make contact with her family. And the first thing is that her father, a pastor, said, "Come home, you still have a place under my roof." The second thing, when she was pregnant, he said, "And your son will be my grandson, and I will raise him in our faith." And that's where the damage stops. That is where he is saying, you have done damage, but you have not destroyed us as a family, and you have not destroyed the next generation, my grandson, from growing up with this. So we see countless examples of that, and that's what the Restorations program is for.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's more about the positive role of religion in restoring communities and restoring families. So that's really great. If you have questions, please leave them in the Q&A. You will see a Q&A on the bottom of your screen. So feel free to ask your questions to any of the panelists, whether that's very specific or more generic. Please drop them there, and we hope to come back to these questions later. Ed, you were already referring to your friend, and that was about gender-specific religious persecution as a source of income for some, whereas the economy or economic motives might kind of perpetuate the persecution. Can you share a little bit more about that, about your friend?
Sure. Page 28 in our booklet, new commercial. So this has to do with the Christian community in Egypt. So female genital mutilation is not just a Muslim issue. It's also a Christian issue in some places, which points to the possible clue that it's not just a religious issue. And this story exemplifies that. So my friend, who is a bishop in Upper Egypt, which is southern Egypt, Bishop Thomas, when he took over as bishop, he found that this practice was happening to the young girls in his diocese. And he said, this has to stop. This is wrong. This is not part of our tradition. It is not part of our theology. And so he instructed all the priests to make sure they preached about it and instructed that this is not and should stop. But unfortunately it didn't. It continued. And so he then traveled, and as the bishop, you're a rock star in that community. I mean, you're really put on a pedestal. Excuse my, it's a little bit profane to say it that way, but it's the case. They really are a big person. And so when he came, he thought, I will share that this is wrong, and then people will stop doing it. But it didn't end. So he thought, okay, let me take a more indirect approach. And he began investigating, and he found out that it was 6 older women who were actually doing the mutilation of these young girls. 6 women in his whole diocese. That's it. There wasn't a lot of people. 6 women. So he went to them. He gathered them all together, and he said, listen, this is not part of our theology. It's wrong. It's not part of our practice. What's going on here? And they said to him, we're widows. We're elderly. We have no income. This is our only source of income. And he said, okay, if I guarantee to pay you your annual salary for the rest of your lives, will you quit? Yes. And it ended overnight. So a very practical solution. And sometimes, and we'll get into that as you ask me questions about what we can do and what the EU can do. Sometimes we need to think not just direct, how do we attack this and tell people stop doing it, which might be counterproductive. And how do we look at some of the other causes? And I won't say root causes because, again, it's complex. There are many issues, many motivations, not just singular motivations. How can we look at many motivations to do that? And then your follow-up question, which you're about to ask me, Arie, and I'll take it before you ask it. Are there other examples of this other places in the world? Yes, so similar ones I can describe in the Dalit community, for instance, in India, where you have the caste system and you have the Dalits, which are at the bottom, and they're looked at as unclean people. So access to natural resources like the local well. So women who are often, they have the task of collecting water, they can't draw water from the local well because of their position. And so they have to go outside of the village, which often puts them in a vulnerable situation where, again, sexual violence is perpetrated against them or simple robbery or assault or other things. So that's a concrete example. And then maybe another one that's people would be able to relate to more, they've heard about it, would be the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, which often have a local grudge. And if you know the situation in Pakistan, often the more impoverished people, coming from a Dalit background but are Christians or Hindus, they live on government land, which is in a quasi sort of situation where they own it, but they don't really own it. And so if they're removed from the land, someone else can take over it. And so often you'll have a dispute where a neighbor wants that land and will accuse someone of blasphemy, get them out of the picture, and then they take over their property. Yep.
Thank you to both of you for this very interesting insights. So there is now a question for both of you, very interesting one. At least historically, religious systems are often male-dominated. To what extent is theology part of the problem? And how can theology or religious leaders be part of the solution as well? Helen?
Well, yes, that is really the question, and it is looking into communities and being willing to say, well, actually, is our theology being used in a way that is actually complicit with self-interested power structures? Now, we don't like to hear that, that's one of those taboo things. But actually, a re-examination of our sacred texts is called for to say, well, actually, were the interpretations, Ed mentioned, how has our religion evolved? Well, were there the interpretations or the translations that we relied on from 50 years ago or 500 years ago done by non-objective parties? They actually were done in such a way or written in such a way that it was actually self-interested. And yes, it did reinforce male dominance in the system and a lot of these harmful understandings that are perhaps slight misunderstandings, but it's just enough that they cause this harmful behavior. So that's exactly what the restorations material does. We identify what we call distortions, and then actually what in the sacred text for Christians are the restorations. So it's taking it and it first acknowledges that theology can be used in a harmful way and saying, but actually there's a power in it in a positive way that can build resilience in the community.
Thank you, Helen. Ed, anything from you on this one?
Yeah, let me take a little different approach because, of course, religious communities, they're in change, constant change. The task, as I see it, is for the state to ensure protect, the first thing they need to do is protect, but they can also stimulate, support dissident voices within religious communities. This is where the problem lies. If you have too strong a connection between a religion and the state, then the religious leaders are in a sense in cahoots or in bed. Maybe we're talking a purity issue here as well with the political leadership. And so that people who have a diverging view of that religion, which includes gender equality, are often oppressed. And that is the state's role to ensure that if somebody wants to break out of religion A and create religion A1, it's identical to religion A, but it has a component that says all people, even women, are equal to men. The state has the obligation to protect them when they want to do that from attacks by the community and from attacks by themselves. So this, I think, is an incredible, again, if people are listening, part of the EEAS, this is something you can do both, you're doing it externally. So in countries where you have an opportunity to work with local authorities, help strengthen their ability to protect divergent religious views. That will go a long way.
Thank you.
Yes, we're moving slowly to the Q&A, but first we want to have a little bit more of an exploration of recommendation. What can we do to improve the situation to stop gender-specific religious persecution? So, Helen, in your report, in Open Doors report, you and I just quote from the report: a substantial, multifaceted community response to gender-specific religious persecution could be truly instrumental in significantly reducing or even eliminating gender-based persecution as a tactic. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Helen, you're muted.
You need to unmute, Helene, if you can.
So sorry. I'm using the crutch of the screen so that I don't mess up the policy recommendations. But Open Doors has, talking about the multifaceted, says, local faith actors have their side of things to do, but we really need policymakers to be identifying this double vulnerability, or very often compound vulnerability, of women and girls from religious minorities. And so the first thing is that change in mindset, first of all, to look for compound vulnerabilities, but also to go through all of the policies, whether it's the targeted aid programs or ensuring, including religion as a factor of vulnerability in any assessment. And this is one of those things you have to go through every single one and say, have we thought about religion as an added vulnerability? Encourage governments to give women equality before the law in every regard. And one that is specifically for this group, maybe you'd like to think about it, is that Open Doors has been encouraging the appointment of an EU special envoy on freedom of religion or belief. So if a number of you think that that is a good option, my colleague Anna Hill, who many of you know, she's the one who would be interested in hearing from you and can coordinate that. So it's taking these very, very, very high level things and saying, okay, how can we cascade those down?
Thank you very much, Ellen, for a presentation very clear about the recommendations from the report. Next question is for Ed about the report of Stefanus Alliance. So the report says that the change from within might take years to achieve, but it is the only legitimate and sustainable way of achieving a lasting change. Ed, is there anything outside actors can do to speed up this process?
Well, I hope so. We don't know for sure, but we hope so. So I started on that answer in my previous answer, talking about the role of the state vis-a-vis religious communities and the first obligation to protect. and then supporting those who have dissenting voices within the religious communities. It's an important issue. Often the case is that dissenting voices meeting a very hostile and often very violent situation in their home countries, not being protected, have to flee, and then they become part of the diaspora, and they don't have the same strength of voice as they would if they were been able to stay. So if somehow you can work with governments to recognize their obligation, their duty to protect. If you could do that, you'd come a long way. But then beyond that, I think a first start would be those who are part of government institutions or the EEAS, more FoRB literacy. So a number of recommendations are in this report. I don't know if you have the link to it, Arie or Elizabeta, you can probably include it. This is a joint venture between us and the Stefanus Alliance and the Danish Center for Human Rights, with funding from the Norwegian and the Danish Ministries of Foreign Affairs. And here you have a number of recommendations where you have the link between FoRB and gender equality together with some SDGs. So for instance, in the realm of education, and here I can be very specific. What are we doing to help countries reform their curriculum in education that depict often women and girls in a negative light, and at the same time, religious minorities in a negative light? Here we have a tremendous responsibility, and not just as state actors, but as state actors who are part of multinational or multilateral groups. So UNESCO produces the GEM report, Global Education Monitoring Report, every year. They have report on a number of metrics. Among them, girls and minorities, but not religious minorities, and definitely not the link between girls who are a member of religious minorities. This is the standard, the gold standard of reports on education every year that comes out. Could member states ask UNESCO to include that in their annual GEM report as one of the metrics that they measure? Likewise, probably the largest donor to education internationally in the developing world is the World Bank. Multinational, multilateral organization. What sort of pressure is being done to make sure that gender equality, which is pretty high, but gender equality linked with freedom of religion or belief is also part of the mandate for them to do. So very, very concrete, and it should be able to be done. Let's see here. Oh, yeah. So access to justice, strengthening rule of law and strengthening justice systems. Here, states that have a well-functioning rule of law system can come a long way by offering training for diplomats and for members of the justice system, both police, judges, lawyers, having projects then that are geared toward that. So for instance, Stefanus Alliance has a project now in 4 different countries working on laws that regulate freedom of religion or belief in the language, creating databases and then training for local lawyers who will be handling these type of cases. This is an excellent way of strengthening not just the situation for girls and religious minorities, but across the board, strengthening the entire government and the entire nation. And then lastly, encouraging, we talk about dialogue, and I think dialogue is a good thing, but we need to have also diapraxy, joint projects between religious communities so they can see one another. And here we think the social capital theory, which talks about 2 different types of social capital, the bonding, which is within a community, and the bridging. So projects that can help social capital bridging between various communities, I think would be very, very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation so far. So let's quickly move on to some questions from the audience. And let's be fair and start with the first question that came in from Hendrik Edmer Rasmussen. Good to have you, Hendrik. A question for Helene. It's a bit surprising to hear that imprisonment is not among the top 5 pressure points for women. It's my impression that at least in Iran, women are imprisoned for their faith, just as for other human rights. Could you please expand a little bit on this one?
Yeah, great question. And one of the things is it's important to understand that this report looks at 50 countries and looking at what the characteristic ways of persecuting women rise to the top across those 50 countries. So indeed, we have a number of countries which are, I would call, equal opportunity imprisoners. So like Iran or Eritrea or North Korea, you find a lot of women in prisons. But that's still fairly low percentage-wise relative to the 50 other countries and the classic ways, the most common ways among everything else that is done in order to either punish or coerce Christian women. So it's just placing that event that you know within that much broader global context.
Thank you, Helen. There is a question in the chat which relates to activities of EPRID, and I will skip that question because it is not directly linked to the reports, and go to the question of Sofia Caseiro, who is asking both of you, how can religious communities be educated for gender equality? Maybe Ed, you could start.
Yeah, great. So get this booklet. Get the Open Doors report, number one. You can get more information, but if you're working with local communities, they know their problems, their challenges. Here you'll provide some tools to actually work with them. Number two, I don't know if you can pull it up there, Arie, a link to the FoRB, the learning platform. It was mentioned in the beginning. Here we have a tremendous tool with video courses in all aspects of freedom of religion and belief, and we're now developing more and more on gender-specific issues. So providing training for local authorities or local religious communities, religious actors. Extremely, extremely important. So there's two tools you can get right away that can help. It won't solve all the problems. Again, you have to have lots of work on the ground with dialogue and discussions between the various groups. But those two tools can give them access to information maybe they haven't thought of before.
Helen?
So I think I've lost track of the question. Just remind me which question Ed was answering.
It was the question how religious communities can be educated for gender equality.
Yeah. So I support everything Ed said. That was fantastic. And one of the things that I would add kind of on the front end of that is religious communities very often don't think that gender inequality is hurting them. They actually some kind of secretly think gender inequality is protecting them. So one of the first points of education is to actually be able to demonstrate that gender inequality is hurting them. And we have actually a lot of resources at our disposal. So the GSRP reports very specifically say that where there are these gender inequalities, there is greater vulnerability of the church. And yet there are also some very basic ways where we can point to the education of girls or the nutrition of girls. And if it's not equal to that of boys, then it holds the community back. It lowers the kind of standard of living of that community. And then we can point to a number of other factors that they like less. Yeah, there's a lot at our disposal to be able to do that. So I would actually say work with a combination of your local faith actors and policymakers to find the point that is most motivating for your particular community that you're trying to impact.
Thank you.
Okay, I will start with more of a comment rather than a question from Alessandro from Christian Solidarity Worldwide. A few years ago, the EAS has helped the Bengali government with digitizing property rights in Bangladesh, which has formalized databases and helped curb dispossession of land. And perhaps this is something civil society should encourage the EAS to replicate across the Indian subcontinent. So that's a very practical way to protect families and protect women.
Arie, very quickly. So this is a great example of this indirect approach. So you're not hitting the problem head on, but you're hitting one of the cores or one of the root causes of the problem. So I think this is excellent. Could you work on property rights, which will then address issues of freedom of religion and belief and gender equality? Great, I love it.
Okay, well, that also partly answered the question from Catharina van Snoorbein from the EAS or from the European Commission. Mainstreaming the religious aspect across EU policies is indeed central to addressing gender-specific religious persecution. What would you see as one or two top priorities for the future of the EU Special Envoy on freedom of religion or belief? Helen, you already referred to the Special Envoy. What are your two top priorities for the Special Envoy?
Well, already the appointment of the Special Envoy would be incredibly significant because it would show that the EU is serious about FoRB, and then it would allow the EU agreed guidelines to protect and promote FoRB that were agreed in 2013 can actually be implemented. So from a gender point of view, recognizing this double vulnerability across all of those platforms and looking into just starting to investigate the tools which are available, such as the global human rights sanctions regime, would allow the EU to start to lead on this topic. So that's just a couple of places to start. But since it's been 16 months since the last special envoy, it's probably the most appropriate place to start.
Thank you, Helen. Another question comes from Gillian Der, who says, if we are wanting to influence states to protect women from religious minorities, we need to get them to change attitudes and training for police and other law enforcement officials. In many cases, the women are subject to repeated violence by the authorities who are technically there to protect them. When they go to them for help, are you developing any programs with this sector? So any gender training for the police and law enforcement officials?
Yeah, so I think I addressed that quite a bit in my other answer to the question when we suggest promoting, strengthening rule of law and all justice systems, including the police. And this is very important. Often when we think in terms of rule of law, we think in creating laws, so working with parliamentarians, which is important. Given the background I have, I'd say that's very important. But also working with all those who must implement the law, including the police. So I fully agree with the statement. And this is something that I would, again, an indirect approach, in a sense, not just being gender and religious sensitive to what's going on, but also creating opportunities for learning. So bringing in I'm a big fan of rehumanizing, because one of the challenges that we see is a dehumanization occurring of both women, they're less than men, and of religious minorities, they're not the same as us, and often referring to them as insects or other things. So if you can bring into the training of police forces women who can speak and religious minorities who can speak and offer a rehumanizing voice, I think this will go a long way. But let me just make it very clear. None of the suggestions we have are what will fix the problem. We need all of them and many others. This is a complex, challenging situation. The world is muddy, and it will not be something that will be fixed or finished with it. It'll have to be continued. So we need to continue to educate. So education will have to be part of it. Constant reform and constant training of officials within the rule of law and justice systems will have to continue. So, but anyway, good comment. I love it.
Yes, definitely. And I would completely support that in a complex dynamic system, which is religious persecution, and especially that being used in a gender specific manner, we really need every level to be addressed. So it really does take everybody working together and at every level. We say a complex situation requires a multifaceted solution.
Thank you, Helen. Well, I believe that we have almost exhausted all the questions. Arie, is there any need for the last question, or we are also running out of time?
Yeah, I think we are running out of time here. There are still a few interesting questions related to the rule of law, but also emphasizing the amount of time it takes for a community to change from within. That point has already been made. But yeah, the people are underlining that we need, that's the best way to really change the society from within. That's true for all societies, by the way, not just for religious communities. But I think it's time to wrap up the conversation.
Well, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to both of you for these comprehensive reports and spending your time in explaining, like the recommendations of these reports and the added value, and encouraging academia and the practitioners and also establishment here in Brussels in the European Union to work on these issues and use recommendations from both of your reports in order to improve the situation on the ground worldwide. So all of you who are present, if you would wish to know more about gender-specific religious persecution reports, please have a look these two reports, and you will find the links in the chat, which were shared. And now I would like to thank to all of you who have been participating in making this webinar possible, especially to our two speakers, Helen and Ed. And also to our audience who came with all these interesting questions. And we need to say that there were more questions in the chat that we could basically, answer at this stage, but we hope that there is going to be a follow-up to this webinar in some time later on, and that we can also continue working in this very much important topic. So the next episode of our EPRID webinars is going to take place on Wednesday, 12th of May, from 2 to 3 Central European Time, as usual. And our guest for the webinar will be Merete Bilde, Policy Advisor at the European External Action Service. And with her, we will discuss the global exchange on religion and society. So I would say goodbye from now, from all of us, from Arie and myself, and on behalf of our speakers, thank you and see you on 12th of May. Stay tuned.